Old Testament and the New Man, Genesis through Joshua, with Dr. Daniel Cantey. As the modern order enters its apparent sunset, Dr. Cantey looks anew at the ancient scriptures to learn what they teach about man and his world. Here he is with today's episode.
Hello, I'd like to welcome everybody to this episode of the Old Testament and the New Man. My name is Daniel Cantey. In the last episode, we talked about, in a preliminary way, in an introductory way, the relationship between the Exodus, the biblical story of Israel leaving Egypt, and the modern world. And what I'm arguing here, the idea that I'm presenting over these two lectures, is that there's a logic within the Exodus that provides us with a kind of DNA for what has happened in the modern world and for certain modern experiences that we have. And I outlined these experiences and gave examples of them in episode 5. These are examples where the rest that we would have felt according to modern ways of experience has been universalized into a kind of freedom or liberation, so that we don't have the same kind of burdens, the same kind of obligations or physical necessities that we would have had to endure in the pre-modern world. In the modern world, we don't have those anymore. And the paradigm here in general is coming underneath an infinite burden represented by the law of the Pharaoh in the story of the Old Testament. And when I say infinite, I mean most directly something that denies all rest and something that is tyrannical and oppressive in the burden that it lays on people. So one comes underneath an infinite burden, and this infinite burden is the preliminary step to freedom or liberation, something that is beyond rest, something that you might call an infinite rest. Now, in the last lecture, I explored how the canon law in the Catholic Church expanded over the course of the Middle Ages, from the High Middle Ages into the Late Middle Ages, how it expanded into an infinite law, and how God became the Pharaoh in this particular instance. He becomes the lawgiver who gives a law that is without rest. And all of this development of the law reaches its culminating point at the Reformation. And today we're going to be discussing the doctrine of justification by faith alone, as it is expounded by Luther and Calvin, and in particular, the experience of justification by faith alone, as it is described by those two thinkers. And we're going to see how it is that this doctrine of justification by faith alone actually picks up the pattern of the Exodus and makes it the entirety of salvation. That if you ask how it is that you are saved, it is by this kind of particular process. And along the way, I'm going to point out how different this is from orthodoxy. I want to say this up front. This is a different way of salvation. This is not the orthodox way. And if we believe that Christ is the way, the truth, and the life, there is a particular way that he is. And that way is given to us in the Orthodox tradition. This is something divergent from that. This is something heterodox, not orthodox. I just want to make that clear at the beginning. But we're going to start with Luther and then Calvin, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the modern world after that. So along the way, I'm going to add one or two points that are particular to the Reformation, as opposed to simply being grounded in the Exodus. There's a couple of doctrinal points that diverge from the Exodus, but are worth us mentioning here as we move forward. But we'll begin with Luther and Calvin, and then we'll move forward from there. So this is going to be a little bit more like a theology lecture, whereas last time was more of a history lecture. This is more of a theology lecture. And the point of this, before I get too deeply here, the point of it is for us to see that the modern world embodies a different way of salvation than the orthodox way. That there's something divergent at work here. So that when we get back to the Old Testament and we're looking at the laws that God gave and the sacrifices that God gave and the experiences of Israel that lead them to the promised land, we should understand that we're looking at a way of salvation. And what we have here is a moment in that way of salvation that is plucked out and universalized in a way that it should not be. Because when you pluck that moment out and universalize it, you've got a different way of salvation. So, that said, all of that in a preliminary note, let's begin with Luther. When Luther joined the Augustinian order of monks as a young man, he threw himself into the life prescribed by his monastic rule. Trusting in his religious practice as the way to salvation, Luther was careful in his obedience to his superiors, diligent in praying, fasting, and study, earnest in preaching, and austere in controlling his body, so that scholar Thomas McDonough aptly describes Luther as, quote, a zealous and exemplary Augustinian monk, end quote. But Luther's rigid obedience did not issue in a humble confidence in grace received. In other words, Luther walked down this path of obedience to his rule and obedience to the law, thinking that it was going to give him grace and peace and salvation. But that's not what happened. Rather, Luther saw that his submission to one law or commandment paled before the others he had not kept, with these others endlessly multiplying the harder Luther strove to obey. His unusually strict adherence to his rule and his confidence in it for comfort gave way to distress as the command that he be perfect grew progressively burdensome. The divine imperative, scholar Gordon Rupp notes of Luther, became something which withered all joy and brought him a torment of doubt and uncertainty and guilt, an inner skepticism which ate corrosively through all the offices of consolation which were offered to him, so says Gordon Rupp. Luther's view of himself as oppressed by the wrath of God and doomed to perdition for the slightest imperfections came to taint his obedience, worship, and prayer with a shrill fear occasionally given voice in later sermons. His internal tortures became a way of life, and the grace for which he hoped was long in coming. Now, this picture of Luther that's generally recognized by scholars who cover his life shows us in outline what it is to live under a God who gives his law as the Pharaoh. Well, let's continue here. Looking upon this early period from later on in his life, Luther recalls that his troubles revolved around one phrase, the righteousness of God. And this phrase, the righteousness of God, can be found in St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 1, verse 17. Luther's teachers understood this righteousness as the righteousness by which God is holy and just and punishes those who break his law. Knowing himself as a perpetual lawbreaker, Luther considered himself destined for that punishment. His inability to overcome the chasm between God's absolute righteousness and his own unflagging sin nourished Luther's hatred of the righteousness of God, provoking him to mumble against such an unforgiving deity in his heart and think even Christ's gospel a message of wrath. And again here, Luther's experience of coming under God and trying to travel along the path of the law is not of rest given along that path, but of rest taken away, and in its stead, anxiety and anguish. In the course of his meditations over the righteousness of God, Luther, however, began to see that God's righteousness does not denote wrath against those who do not meet the law's requirement. Instead, it refers to something vastly different. It refers to the gift of God given through Jesus Christ by faith, a righteousness passively received by the believer that covers all of one's sins with grace freely given. So here righteousness means something totally different. It's not that God is judging you and that he is holy and just and awful and terrifying in that judgment. It's rather that Christ has given you grace freely, passively received by you. You do nothing for it. There is no struggle here. You receive it, having given no effort of your own. The righteousness that demands satisfaction via obedience, at one with the law that had vexed Luther's conscience so profoundly, succumbs before another righteousness. This new righteousness, the righteousness of faith alone, repudiates the righteousness supposedly attained by the law and meets the law's requirements through grace. When Luther first had this realization in what scholars refer to as his tower experience, he was supposedly in a tower, and he has this sort of lightning bolt or light bulb moment when he sees, the righteousness of God means something entirely different from what he thought it means. When he has this realization, Luther felt himself, quote, to be born anew and to enter through open gates into paradise itself, end quote. And this is Luther writing. This is his liberation moment. This is his moment where he moves through the Red Sea and he escapes the Egypt of his torture under the law. Luther experienced that grace as the pivot on which his religious consciousness turned from sadness and anguish to joy. Luther would subsequently theorize the Christian life in his theology according to two steps that mirror his own religious breakthrough. The first step entails recognition of oneself as a sinner, acknowledging one's inability to measure up to the law. The more that you try to obey, the more you perceive the absence of the inner love of God in one's attempts at obedience. These reveal that everything that the believer does, speaks, and thinks opposes God, so that the Christian sees himself as totally under God's judgment and worthy of damnation. Believers see that they possess not a single spark of the love of God, and that all human resources, wisdom, knowledge, and strength are nothing, so that one is, quote, truly humbled and reduced to nothing in his own eyes, finding in himself nothing whereby he may be justified and saved, end quote. The law presses the believer down with the futility of human effort so thoroughly that one has no choice but to flee to Christ alone. This constitutes the second step in Luther's theology of salvation, the individual's right honoring of God by receiving his mercy without trying to share in his glory by works. And if I could just pause here for a moment, this is another one of the ways that the Protestant way of thinking about salvation differs from the Orthodox one. In the Protestant way of salvation, if you think that your works contribute to salvation, this means that you're actually trying to share in God's glory in a way that you shouldn't. It's a form of pride. Whereas in the Orthodox way, you're struggling against your passions. And this is what you do by the grace and mercy of God with his grace to help you repent. So it's a really different attitude towards the activity of obedience. For Luther, rather than striving to establish one's own merit through obedience, one accepts that merit as the external righteousness of Christ given to a believer who has done nothing to deserve it. And I want to emphasize here the externality. It's as though salvation and righteousness are stamped upon you from outside. They don't come from within. They don't have anything to do with your efforts or your attempts at obedience. So one receives this righteousness and the justification it conveys completely apart from works and by faith alone, a doctrine whose early and definitive elaboration appears in Luther's pamphlet, The Freedom of a Christian, or Luther's essay, The Freedom of a Christian, in the year 1520, just a few years after the Reformation started in earnest. The personal appropriation of grace through faith so that one knows it for him or herself, a grace everywhere and always antithetical for Luther to the law with respect to justification. This grace is a central facet of this doctrine of faith alone. So received grace frees the believer from the law's curse, just as it unites the heart with Christ. Now, what I want to do here, having described this, the general arc of Luther's experience, we can already see how he comes underneath the law of God as a law that denies all rest, as an infinite law. And we can already see that he has a liberation moment, that he breaks free, that he comes out from underneath it. But I want to look a little bit more deeply here because there's a key passage from Luther's commentary on Galatians that is really critical to deepen our understanding of his experience as he himself understood it. Luther observes, for example, that, quote, "Those who perform the works of a law with the intention of being justified through them not only do not become righteous, but become twice as unrighteous. I have experienced this," he says, "in both myself and in many others," end quote. And a paragraph after he says this, that the more that you try to be obedient, the more you're going to become unrighteous, we have this definitive selection, this definitive quotation here that shows us how one's development spiritually occurs, the way one is pushed towards justification by faith alone in terms of one's experience with the law. So I'm going to read this. It's a rather long quotation, but I think worth it. So here we go. "Therefore, anyone who seeks righteousness through the law does nothing by his repeated actions but acquire the habit of this first action, which is that God in his wrath and awe is to be appeased by works. On the basis of this opinion, he begins to do works. Yet he can never find enough works to make his conscience peaceful. But he keeps looking for more, And even in the ones he does perform, he finds sin. Therefore, his conscience can never become sure, but he must continually doubt and think this way. You have not sacrificed correctly. You have not prayed correctly. You have omitted something. You have committed this or that sin. Then the heart trembles and continually finds itself loaded down with wagon loads of sins that increase infinitely, so that it deviates further and further from righteousness until it finally acquires the habit of despair. Many who have been driven to such despair cried out miserably in the agony of death, "Miserable man that I am! I have not observed the rules of my monastic order. Where shall I flee from the countenance of Christ, the wrathful judge? If only I had been a swineherd or the most ordinary of men." Thus, at the end of his life, a monk is weaker, more beggarly, more unbelieving, and more fearful than he was at the beginning when he joined the order. The law or human traditions or the rule of his monastic order were supposed to heal and enrich him in his illness and poverty, but he became weaker and more beggarly than tax collectors and harlots. Therefore, neither past nor present works are enough for him, regardless of their quantity or quality. But he continually looks at and looks for ever different ones, by which he attempts to appease the wrath of God and to justify himself, until in the end he is forced to despair. Therefore, it is impossible for men who want to provide for their salvation through the law, as all men are inclined to do by nature, ever to be set at peace. In fact, they only pile laws upon laws, by which they torture themselves and others, and make their consciences so miserable that many of them die before their time because of excessive anguish of heart. For one law always produces 10 more until they grow to infinity. End quote. Now, these are Luther's words, and the idea of the law growing to infinity is where I get the concept of the infinite law that Luther came under. But let's see how it is that Luther's Christian develops according to a path that he clearly walked himself. Well, you start with the law thinking that it is going to heal and enrich you in your illness and poverty. But you find rather that by the law you are driven to the habit of despair, that you suffer the agony of death, that you become weaker and more beggarly than tax collectors and harlots, that your conscience becomes so miserable that you may indeed die before your time because of excessive anguish of heart. And on the whole, you have no rest, no peace of conscience. Well, how does this happen? This happens because when you went under the law, you did not know that it was the law of the Pharaoh. Luther didn't start out thinking that he was going under a law that was going to oppress and tyrannize him, but that's precisely what he found. And he found that because the law's commands are growing to infinity, or have grown to infinity. One law always produces 10 more, he says, until they grow to infinity, echoing the development of the law over the 12th and 13th and into the 14th century. So this infinite canon law, this canon law that is both universal and exact, came down upon Luther with the heaviest of weight, and he felt it as anguish. He felt it as the surety of damnation, and he hated the righteousness of God, by which God is holy and just and judges those who have broken his law. But it's after this that Luther discovers grace. For grace as the righteousness of God, Luther's new understanding of that concept, shatters the agony produced by the law by announcing a way of righteousness completely apart from works and by faith alone, trusting in the righteousness of Christ given freely by the Savior and in total passivity, received in total passivity by the believer. This new way of justification rescues the believer from the torment of the infinite law because it successfully negates that law's presupposition, which is that the law adds positively to salvation. In the wake of justification grasped by faith alone, the law has lost all power to frighten because it has lost all power to tempt. It can no longer convince you that it is the way. It is the way towards grace and life and blessing. Faith accomplishes then what the law's expansion to infinity could not, realizing the total lack of righteousness, the utter insufficiency for justification of both human nature and the law. Because your experience under the law for Luther drives you away from its commands as well as just at the same time as it drives you away from trust in any of your own powers. Those powers are whittled down to literally nothing. The total annulment of the law as a way of salvation, and therefore the quieting of its terrors, is the passive righteousness that struck Luther as though he had entered through open gates into paradise itself. And again, this is the liberation moment. This is the Exodus moment. And it's very important to understand that these two steps make up salvation for Luther. If you ask, how is it that the person is saved? You come underneath the infinite law, you turn to the grace of Christ as the rescue from that infinite law. You come under the law of the Pharaoh, and then you are liberated. Then you go through the Red Sea, and the law no longer applies to you. And as far as the things that are relevant for salvation, that actually save you, this is the process. So the idea of the Exodus, or rather the story of the Exodus, has been plucked out, and it has been made definitive for the entirety of salvation. Now, this doesn't happen only for Luther. This happens as well for Calvin. So we're going to turn to John Calvin here. Calvin has a slightly different emphasis, as we're going to see. He doesn't really talk about the infinite law in terms of the number of the law's commands. It's rather, as we're going to see here in just a moment, it's rather about terror under the judgment of God. But the overall effect of coming before God is the same as with Luther, and we're going to see this in just a moment. So, Calvin's story of religious experience begins with human nature's temptation to ascribe righteousness to itself in light of its God-given gifts, including natural virtues and the goodness that men can achieve according to creaturely standards. So in other words, you may look at yourself and you say, well, I'm fairly intelligent, or, well, I'm good looking, or, well, I have certain abilities or virtues or whatever it is that you may have. And then you think that you're a pretty swell person as a result of that. That's the confidence that you have in yourself because of gifts that God has given you. Concentration on these gifts for Calvin results in pride in one's supposed merit and a consequent sluggishness towards the tireless obedience that the law requires. Human nature, according to Calvin, always wants to flatter itself regarding its abilities, but this flattery is anathema to justification in Christ. Calvin thus directs the believer to the law, not that it should justify, just as for Luther. For Calvin, the law does not justify. It adds nothing to salvation. But you come before the law for Calvin, that by it believers might, quote, shake off their sluggishness and be, quote, pinched awake to their imperfection, end quote. And this pinching for Calvin, which doesn't really sound all that bad on the surface, nonetheless denotes a terrifying confrontation with God's holiness that decimates one's former confidence in his or her own abilities. Calvin describes this experience, this coming before God's judgment, from two angles. The first angle is focused upon the holiness of God, which is to say, looking at the confrontation from above. The other angle focuses on the depravity of human nature. So it sort of looks at the confrontation from below. Now we're going to look at two passages, one focused on God and one focused on man, or on humankind, the sinner. And we'll see how these two fit together and what kind of experience they provoke for such a person. Calvin writes, "Our discourse is concerned with the justice not of a human court, but of a heavenly tribunal, lest we measure by our own small measure the integrity of works needed to satisfy the divine judgment. Yet it is amazing with what great rashness and boldness this is commonly defined. Indeed, one can see how there are none who more confidently, and as people say, boisterously chatter over the righteousness of works, than they who are monstrously plagued with manifest diseases or creak with defects beneath the skin. That happens because they do not think about God's justice, which they would never hold in such derision if they were affected by even the slightest feeling of it." And I want to stop here for just a moment. Calvin's emphasis here is on a particular kind of experience, which for him amounts to a particular kind of feeling. The feeling of coming before God's judgment. Continuing on here. "Yet surely God's judgment is held of very precious little value if it is not recognized as God's justice, and so perfect that nothing can be admitted except what is in every part whole and complete and undefiled by any corruption. Such was never found in man and never will be. For before God's justice, we deal with a serious matter and do not engage in frivolous word battles. To this question, I insist, we must apply our mind if we would profitably inquire concerning true righteousness. How shall we reply to the heavenly judge when he calls us to account? Let us envisage for ourselves that judge, not as our minds naturally imagine him, but as he is depicted for us in Scripture, by whose brightness the stars are darkened, by whose strength the mountains are melted, by whose wrath the earth is shaken, beside whose purity all things are defiled, whose righteousness not even the angels can bear, who makes not the guilty man innocent, whose vengeance, when once kindled, penetrates to the depths of hell. Let us behold him, I say, sitting in judgment to examine the deeds of men. Who will stand confident before his throne? Who can dwell with the everlasting fire, the prophet asks. Who can dwell with the everlasting burnings? If thou, O Lord, shouldst mark iniquities, O Lord, who shall stand? Now Calvin paints this picture of God's judgment seat with the express intention of terrifying those who take it seriously. To come before such a God as judge is not to come before one who turns towards his creatures in love and forgiveness and mercy. It is to come before a judge who is ready to condemn them, and by whose power alone they ought to be knocking their knees together. They ought to be quaking before him, because he comes not to make the innocent man, or rather the guilty man, innocent. He comes rather to judge. We see echoes in this portrait of the Pharaoh, if not the Pharaoh himself, to the extent that this picture of God gives no rest. It is meant to produce anxiety. So if we look at the confrontation from the picture of God, or from the point of view of God, and this is how it looks, what about from the point of view of the sinner? Here's what Calvin has to say about this perspective. When we come under the teachings of the law, we may at length infer two things. First, by comparing the righteousness of the law with our life, we learn how far we are from conforming to God's will. And for this reason, we are unworthy to hold our place among his creatures, still less to be accounted his children. Secondly, in considering our powers, we learn that they are not only too weak to fulfill the law, but utterly non-existent. From this necessarily follows mistrust of our own virtue, then anxiety and trepidation of mind. For the conscience cannot bear the weight of iniquity without soon coming before God's judgment. And this is the judgment that he just described. So back to Calvin. Truly, God's judgment cannot be felt without evoking the dread of death. So also, constrained by the proofs of its impotence, conscience cannot but fall straightway into deep despair of its own powers. Both these emotions engender humility and self-abasement. Thus it finally comes to pass that man, thoroughly frightened by the awareness of eternal death, which he sees as justly threatening him because of his own unrighteousness, betakes himself to God's mercy alone as the only haven of safety. Thus, realizing that he does not possess the ability to pay to the law what he owes, and despairing in himself, he is moved to seek and await help from another quarter. End quote. Now I want to focus for a moment on the first part of this passage, and the central part. Because here we see a picture in Calvin that is much like Luther. You learn from the law that you have no righteousness, that you are not able to obey it. And also, you learn that you have no power at all to obey the law. Again, there is no struggle here. Your powers to be obedient are utterly non-existent, according to Calvin. But beyond this, when you come before God's judgment, this brings one to despair. A thorough fright, in Calvin's words, that is the awareness of eternal death, or the dread of death. To come before God the judge is, as it were, to die due to anxiety and horror at what one deserves. And God, it seems, is ready to execute this judgment. So from the angle of the human being, We have again come before the wrathful judge, the all-powerful Pharaoh, who does not look kindly at us so long as we are focused on trying to obey him. To know the immeasurable greatness of God and his holiness in judgment is to know at the same time the antithetically immeasurable smallness of humanity, and beyond this, the perdition awaiting sinners apart from grace. Saving knowledge of God for Calvin presupposes this dual realization of the justice and majesty of God on the one hand, and the worthlessness and smallness of his creatures on the other, his disobedient creatures, really. It is to come under a kind of infinite guilt or damnation before this God. Again, a total reduction, a total denial of the idea that you would have rest before God, rest in God's presence, rest given in the context of the law of God. All of that is absent. In fact, it is purposefully driven out. So what then is the antidote to this? What is the rescue? Well, just as for Luther, one turns to Christ's grace, so for Calvin. Looking to Christ out of nature's depravity in this situation where you imagine yourself before the judgment seat of God, and damnation, it seems, is coming down to you, and the great sentence is coming upon you for your guilt. You look to Christ in this particular context. In doing so, the believer observes, quote, a wonderful consolation, that we perceive judgment to be in the hands of him who has already destined us to share with him the honor of judging. Far indeed is he from mounting his judgment seat to condemn us. So in other words, when you're standing before God and you fear this judgment, this incomprehensible and powerful judgment, this eternal judgment, you turn your gaze to Christ and you see that Christ has given you again the precise opposite of this. Now you are going to have the honor of judging with God, and you are no longer condemned. The individual stricken unto nothingness then discovers a great solace, a righteousness imputed by Christ's grace, that Christ may care for the consciences of his people. And this turn of events elicits the, quote, feeling of delight, end quote, in which the heart throws off the threat of perdition. So you look to Christ in the context of judgment before the wrath of God and the holiness of God. You look to Christ and you see rescue. You see all of that judgment goes away. And you see that you are raised up with Christ, that you are saved, that grace has been given to you, that your conscience is now cared for. And this in turn provokes in you your religious experience, your experience of salvation, is a feeling of delight. These are Calvin's words. So Luther describes his tower experience, where it seems as though the gates of paradise were thrown open and he had gone through them. But for Calvin, the words are a little bit simpler, a little bit more austere. He says this provokes in you a feeling of delight, which one would naturally feel being freed from such a horrible burden, this burden that seems to come naturally for the reformers from the law of God. But this again with Calvin is the law of liberation, just as we saw with Luther. You come before the infinite law, in Calvin's case, the infinite judgment of God, and then you are liberated by that judgment by Christ. Liberated from that judgment, by Christ, by his grace alone. And we see the law of the Pharaoh then preceding the freedom of the Exodus. In his role as lawgiver, God himself appears as the Pharaoh. We may say God the Father, although Luther and Calvin don't really put it in exactly those terms. On the other hand, God the Son, the Christ, takes the role of Moses. He is the liberator. One, God as lawgiver, imposes the law of restlessness and deprives the believer of all rest. The other, God as liberator, God as Moses, really Christ as Moses, liberates and frees from the law. And this is the basic dynamic of salvation for both Luther and Calvin. If you were to ask them and those who follow them, what saves, they would say, faith alone saves, by grace alone, without works, and this is how it happens. This is the experience of how it happens. Now, I want to point out here that again, this is the Exodus plucked out and made universal as a result of this logic. and that the infinite law, a law that deprives of all rest, is now intrinsic to salvation. That you have to come under this law that really in truth is not the law of God because it gives no rest, but it is necessary for the Protestant understanding of salvation. Now, it's at this point, since I've outlined how both Luther and Calvin follow the dynamic of the Exodus in their understanding of salvation and in their doctrines of justification by faith alone, it's at this point that I want to add a little bit from Luther's theology. And these are not basic points that I think Calvin would disagree with or that Reformed people in general would disagree with, although Calvin doesn't really talk about them in exactly the same terms. So, Luther says that when the believer turns to Christ's grace and is saved by grace alone, at this point, Christ becomes a curse for us. And this is something that Luther takes quite seriously. He maintains that Christ took the sin of the world upon his body, and that on the cross, one finds Christ among thieves because sin has made him a thief. The Christian, that is the Lutheran Christian, should consider his or her sins and, turning to Christ on the cross, understand them to be Christ's, as if he had committed them. The sin that Christ shoulders in our stead, says Luther, adheres to him not only as a quality or adjectively, like a color or something like that, something relatively external, but substantively. So Christ becomes our sin. Like sinners who find themselves so condemned that they are not only miserable or accursed, but seem to have become misery, sin, and the curse, so Christ becomes all of these on behalf of persons. The believer must affirm that Christ has put on humanity's sin in its fullness, including one's own, if faith in Christ should justify. So in other words, not only have all of your sins left you for Luther, but they have, as it were, entered Christ. He has become them. Made a curse for us because wrapped up in our sins, Christ's work in justification submits him to the assault of the law's curse. Here again, we see the law no longer applying to the believer who has accepted Christ's grace, and it's as though the law has to go somewhere, and so it goes to Christ. The law sees that Christ has taken on the world's sin and castigates him, attacking him and killing him on the cross. Luther writes, quote, "Now the law comes and says, I find Christ a sinner who takes upon himself the sins of all men. I do not see any other sins than those in him. Therefore let him die on the cross." And so the law attacks him and kills him. End quote. This conflict with the law's curse points to the deeper conflict within Christ himself, who by taking up humanity's sin, on the one hand, has become the sin of the entire world. So on the one hand now, Christ is sin. On the other hand, Christ is still righteousness and justification. He is both of these at the same time. These opposites within Christ battle one another as the sin of the entire world attacks righteousness with the greatest possible impact and fury. So these two parts of Christ are battling with one another, as it were. But sin cannot conquer the unconquerable and does not prevail against Christ's immortal and invincible righteousness. On the cross, the life of Christ, quote, emerged victorious when it had been conquered, conquering and killing death in turn, overcoming the challenge of sin and the law. In this way, death loses its sting, a blessing gained by faith in Christ's righteousness alone, and again, without the help of works, with no struggle, so that the believer lives freely under grace. And it's important to see this here, that Christ becomes the curse and that the law attacks him, but that he overcomes these things. So the freedom of the believer, the liberation of the conscience from the curse of the infinite law or the curse of the law of the Pharaoh, goes to Christ and he defeats them. Christians who have made the transition from law to grace, having removed the law as an obstacle, embrace Christ as their new life. In Freedom of a Christian, Luther uses the analogy of union and marriage to explain how the believer receives this life, gaining blessing from Christ while relinquishing one's sin to him. Christ the bridegroom enters the union as grace, salvation, and life with a glory that stands over the law. So Christ brings all the good things to the marriage union. The believer comes, on the other hand, as a bride under the curse, deserving damnation for sin. So the believer comes, on the other hand, with all the negative things. The two of them are going to have a union. Christ brings all the good things. The believer brings all the bad things. When faith unites them, with the believer grasping Christ's work on the cross in a personal and effectual way, the qualities attending to the bridegroom transfer to the bride. So everything that was Christ's now becomes ours, while the qualities that attended to the bride migrate to the bridegroom. Luther writes, quote, "Now let faith come between them, and sin's death and damnation will be Christ's, while grace, life, and salvation will be the soul's. For if Christ is a bridegroom, he must take upon himself the things which are his bride's, and bestow the things that are his." End quote. The believer thus puts on Christ's righteousness as imputed, not earned, but freely given by the Savior, and the sins that he or she might commit are made of no account because the righteousness of Christ covers them. Not only has Christ killed the law that kills, but he granted eternal blessing by the free bestowal of righteousness. Now, again, these are points that are stated in Luther. I think, Calvin and folks who have followed in Calvin's train would basically agree with this picture. Before converting to Orthodoxy, I was Presbyterian, and I heard these precise points come from Presbyterian or Calvinist pulpits. So I think it's very easy to say that, yes, they're on the same page about this. So what I want to add here is that when we think about the process of justification for the Protestant, for Luther and Calvin, and for those Protestants who follow after them closely, you have the infinite law, or the law of the Pharaoh. You have liberation from that law. And then the third step that I want to add here, which gives us a little something beyond the Exodus, is Christ taking on the law's punishment and taking on sin. That those things migrate to him. So we have, instead of 2 steps, we have 3. Again, come under the infinite law as the law of the Pharaoh, liberation from the infinite law as Israel moving through the Red Sea, liberation from the law, and then the law transfers onto Christ. These are the basic 3 steps if we're going to think about how salvation works, with the additional step included of what this means for Christ. Now, it's at this point that I want to shift to the modern world. Because if this is our paradigm, if this is our pattern for how salvation works, how exactly would that map onto certain experiences that we have had in the modern world, things that I described in episode 5? Well, in order to answer that question, the first thing we have to discuss is what the law is. For Luther, when he talks about the law of God, it was the law of God as experienced in the conscience. And for Luther, this experience was internal and not material. Now, the law may have been an external thing, but for him, to be released from its burden is to be released in the conscience. But what I would argue, and I make this case elsewhere in greater depth, is that the law in the modern world, the law after the Reformation, more directly, is natural law. That the law in other words, the law in other words, is something that is embodied in nature and in external things. And Calvin is essential in this shift, in my opinion. And again, I don't have time to make this argument with quite the depth that it deserves here, but I do make it in other places. That in the modern world from the Reformation forward and developing over centuries, the law is both the natural environment, the law is our bodies as a part of that environment, the law even includes the neighbor as part of the external world. So if you think about all the contexts in which we are to be embedded physically, we're embedded physically on the earth that God has given us. We're embedded within our bodies. They are a kind of physical embedding for us as long as we are in this life. And we are arguably also embedded with others. That this is certainly something that we see in Genesis, for example, and to some greater or lesser extent, we are always embedded with others. But these things, these examples of nature, of our nature in the modern world, have become the infinite law. They are the things from which we have to escape. They are the things that limit and constrain us in such a way that we see in them the law of the Pharaoh. They present to us a kind of tyrannical and restless burden. So our salvation has been to run away from them, to get away from the obligations and the burdens that they impose on us. Now, I want to add to this claim that I'm making here, that this doesn't mean that people living over the last several centuries of the modern world have explicitly thought of nature as a horrible burden. Most of them haven't. They haven't necessarily thought that. They were probably thinking instead of something like progress, or something like technological development, or something like human betterment, or something like creating a perfect society. That's probably what they were thinking. They weren't focused on the negative. They were focused on making something better, actually improving upon the world that God has created. But nonetheless, the attitude toward nature is of something that must be overcome and escaped. We must be liberated from it. Because nature is uncomfortable. Nature is limiting. Nature constrains us. Nature binds us. And we have to get past that. And so among the major motifs that we see in the modern world in terms of development is this idea of the mastery of nature, or this idea of creating a buffered self so that all of the dangers and vulnerabilities of nature no longer touch us. And what we have done over these last several centuries is to have acted as if somehow nature were this burden, nature were this tyranny, nature were this thing that would make us restless, and from which, therefore, we must do everything we can to free ourselves. It turns out as well by this logic that throwing off natural law under the assumption that it is an infinite law, that it is tyrannical and burdensome and gives us no rest, that this means also throwing off our limits, and thus we become infinite possibility creatures. To be liberated from a law that limits us is to become limitless in our own way. And having possibilities for us, for our way of life, unthinkable to people of previous ages. We are infinite creatures as we have infinite rest, which is to say liberation from the physical world, liberation from natural law, and from the infinite law that we seem to assume silently that it has become. Now, that's a big claim, and I'm going to argue it a little bit by examples. So let's return to one or two of the examples that I made in episode 5, where I talked about modern experience. We're going to start here with the automobile. Now, let's assume that the infinite law, the law of the Pharaoh, is in fact natural law. That if we have to make a long trip, we're using our legs, that we've got to walk or exert ourselves, and then we're going to rest, and then we're going to walk or exert ourselves some more. If it's hot, we're going to look for the next watering hole or some shade. But let's assume that we see this as too burdensome to be endured. Now, this is difficult, and we have to liberate ourselves from it. That the constraints of bodily existence, the knowledge of space and time that is imposed upon us by having to use our legs, or having, say, even to use a horse, something that has to rest, that knowledge is something that we have to free ourselves of, that we have to escape. How do we find that infinite freedom? Well, we find that infinite freedom in the automobile. Because the automobile, as I described in episode 5, is as though the moment of rest is plucked out. That moment when we're seated, when we're not moving, is plucked out and universalized. So it is made definitive of travel across that long distance. In this case, with the automobile, we are no longer constrained by our bodies, but we are as though without them, relatively speaking. So we have found our Moses. We have found our Exodus. We are no longer constrained under this tyrannical or burdensome infinite law. But let's think, because there's something else to be added to this. What is it that allows us to travel? What is it that allows us to move with such speed that gives us such amazing and unheard of mobility? Well, clearly it's the engine. It's the engine that liberates us from the law, that takes on the burden of all of the effort that we would have made to make that trip, to travel that distance. And yet it does so with arguably a far more burdensome task. There's a far heavier burden laid on the engine, because not only does it get us from point A to point B, but it does so quickly, it does so rapidly, in such a way that our possibilities are greatly expanded. Now, in the example from Luther, when one accepts the grace of Christ passively, the law goes on to Christ. Christ is the one who bears the law that frees us. He is the one who has to battle the law that frees us. He is the one who battles the law and overcomes it. And this is part of our freedom. But just as it is Christ who battles the law of salvation, according to Luther in the doctrine of justification by faith alone, so now it is the engine that battles the law of our creaturely limits, of our bodily limits. It is the law, or rather the engine, that takes on the burden of our physical existence and conquers it. It is the machine that liberates. Salvation occurs by the engine taking on the burden of the infinite law while we are completely free from that burden. And it overcomes that burden by allowing us to have the infinite possibility of travel by automobile. So the engine, the machine, that thing which is restless, that thing which must work without rest, which suffers the burden of restlessness at the same time that it frees us from natural existence, that machine takes the place of Christ in the natural world. Now, that's kind of an interesting way of looking at the automobile. Can we say it about every kind of machine? Well, there's a whole lot of different kinds of machines out there, and I don't think everyone necessarily is a little Christ suffering the law of the Pharaoh in order to liberate us. For example, when I use a coffee maker, I don't necessarily think that. Or when I have an alarm clock, I don't necessarily think that about these individual machines. On the other hand, when we look at the totality of our technological lives, when we think not about each and every small machine and what it does, but when we think about the totality of the liberation from the natural world in which modern people live, as a result of all of these machines in the aggregate, then we experience again the notion that the natural world is an infinite law from which we must be liberated, and that our technologies give us that liberation as a way of life in probably more ways than we're aware of on a day-to-day basis. And that the active element that liberates us is the machine. It is the technology. That the technology bears the burden of the law for us. It becomes sin, to put it in Luther's terms. It becomes the burden and overcomes the burden, just as Christ takes on sin and the law on the cross and overcomes them. And so all of these technologies together liberate us and give us a life that is, at the very least, at arm's length from what human natural existence was for at least a few millennia. And on the greater side, almost completely liberates us from what that life was. Now, I want to give one more example, and this one is going to look different from the automobile. This is the example of the sexual revolution. Now, in this case, the infinite law that we're trying to escape from is not the physical world per se. It's rather other people within particular contexts in which we have burdens that we have to deal with them or obligations that we have towards them. So marriage, children, labor for women, these are all particular obligations. These are burdens that are placed on us by the nature of our relationships with others. This is what it is that we want to escape in our sexual revolution, in our sexual freedom. And again, here primarily I'm thinking of promiscuity, although the sexual revolution has clearly extended well beyond that. So we want to do away with the context of work, and we want to have the rest, as I mentioned in episode 5, which is the pleasure of the sexual experience. Pluck it out from marriage. Pluck it out from the context of procreation and labor and the raising of children. Pluck it out from all of that, and let it be infinitized. Let it become limitless itself, and let us have access to this infinite rest. So that is our freedom, our liberation, is the removal of sex from this context. It is an infinite pleasure of freedom without burden, or so it might be sold to us. Again, a particular moment plucked out and universalized, just as the Exodus is plucked out of the story of the creation of Israel and universalized, made the way of salvation. The final question here in this particular example, though, is, well, where is Christ If Christ becomes the machine because he is the one who takes on the burden in the example of the automobile, well, there are no machines here. Who is it, then, that takes on the burden? And the answer is the sexual partner who is alienated by the refusal of assuming that person's burden. So if you were to say with someone that you sleep with, as someone who lives in this sort of liberated world, well, I'm going to sleep with you, but I will have no burdens with you. I will take no obligations of yours. I will have no duties towards you. If you say that towards this person, then you say to them, you will bear the law of my freedom. You will bear the alienation that I will have no obligation performed towards you, that there is no burden that binds me to you. And so the person that you're with, from whom you're gathering the pleasure of the sexual act, is the person who then bears the burden. But interestingly enough, this is a mutual burden, because if everyone is equally involved in a culture of sexual revolution, if all of them are equally involved in this culture of freedom, of liberation, then all of them are imposing the law on others. And so there is a law to be borne. Interestingly, it seems like this is kind of an inverted version of the obligations of marriage, the obligations of bearing children, the obligations of labor. You have a new thing to bear in this particular case, and that burden is alienation. That burden is the idea that there is no one there to bear your hardships with you. No one will commit themselves to you to get through these things. And so you are left alone. Now, again, to sum up this way of salvation, you've got coming under the infinite law, the law of the Pharaoh, the law of God, according to the Reformers. You've got liberation from that law in the story of Israel. It's going out of the Red Sea, being led by Moses, escaping the law of the Pharaoh. For the Reformers, it's turning to the grace of Christ, received passively with no works, no reference to the law. That's your salvation. And then for Luther, and also secondarily for Calvin, the idea that Christ now bears the burden of the law, that he is the one who suffers what it was that was destined for the Christian, or the agony and anxiety that the Christian was undergoing. So we have these three steps that give us an idea of how to think about our experiences in the modern world. I think there are other experiences that we can apply this to. But I bring this up, and I want to close with this here. I bring this up because as we are studying the story of the creation of Israel, we are studying a way of salvation. It is implicit in what is happening. To be created as God's creature and to live as that creature is the way of salvation that God has given to us. To be formed in his image, with his likeness, and in his likeness, in the way that God has designed for us. This is what it is to be in union with God, to have closeness with him. But this is a different way of salvation that we see in the modern world. And I believe, as I've stated here, that there's a kind of theological DNA for it, which I've tried to explain. This is something separate from the path that we are treading here as we move through this course from Genesis to Joshua. And I want to bear that in mind as we move further into the Exodus and look at the law of God, as we will come to here in the next lecture or two, and at further examples as the Israelites move to the Promised Land, as they move to their rest in Canaan. Thank you.
The Old Testament and the New Man, Genesis through Joshua with Dr. Daniel Cantey. Dr. Cantey taught religion and philosophy at Bethel University from 2012 to 2019. He is a graduate of Yale Divinity School and Emory University and lives with his family in Clarksville, Tennessee. This has been a listener and viewer-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.